In this lesson, we're going to talk about the defeature function in SOLIDWORKS parts and assemblies. Let's start by opening up the familiar engine for motion assembly. There may be times when you need to send someone outside of your organization a simplified version of your product. You may need to send just a simplified part or a simplified assembly. We're going to take a look at both of those situations using parts from this engine assembly. For example, let's say that this oil pan is something that we need to send out for either a quote or we need to have some thermal analysis done on it. A thermal analysis is probably a better situation to look at because the quote will need to look at all of the detail. In fact, the detail will greatly affect the quote. But in a thermal analysis, there are some details such as these cutouts that we used or the sketch text that we used to demonstrate the wrap function, which will actually hinder the thermal analysis. The defeature tool can be found under the Tools menu, Defeature. This is a multi-step process, and SOLIDWORKS gives you some helpful information to get started. The first step allows you to identify items that you want to keep. And we'll just run through this at first to get some feeling for how the function works in general. I'm going to say that I don't want SOLIDWORKS to remove this level of detail. So these indentations for the bolt heads should be left in the model. I really would like to get rid of the sketch text and these circles, but there's nothing else that I want to change about the model. So let's go to the next step in the defeature process. SOLIDWORKS is removing internal details at this point. And now it's going to allow me to compare two versions of the part. Being able to visually compare like this is a nice advantage. Being able to see the parts side by side, and one rotates as I rotate the other one. So let's get rid of these items to remove. Let's select all these circles, or I'll just click on one and say select feature. And we'll do the same over here. Select feature. And then we'll click on the next button. SOLIDWORKS removes that feature as well. And now it should show up in the preview. So at this point, we have a model that's been defeatured and it's ready to be sent out. SOLIDWORKS is going to give me some options for how to post the results. I can save the model as a separate file. I can publish the model to Content Central, or I can save these settings for future use. I just want to save the model as a separate file with no link to the original. And we'll call this defeatured oil pan. Now it shows up in its own window with the features missing that I wanted to exclude. It has a single defeatured feature in the feature tree, and it's ready to be sent out to a customer. Now you could also create this sort of thing and send it to them using an e-drawing, but they wouldn't be able to put the e-drawing into the assembly. Let's go back and take a look at defeaturing the entire assembly. The option for defeature in an assembly is located in the same location under the Tools menu, Defeature. The process for defeaturing the assembly has a couple of extra steps. For example, it can remove all internal components, and internal components are going to mean some of these parts that are on the inside. The crankshaft will probably be considered an external component since it has a face that is exposed to the outside on both ends. But all of these minor components like the springs, the valves, even the camshaft, the rocker, and all of these parts, probably also the piston and the connecting rods, will all be eliminated. We can also eliminate components based on their size compared to the rest of the assembly. So we'll say that components less than 10% of the assembly size should be removed. And beyond that, you can also select special components that you want to manually remove. Beyond that, you can select exceptions to this. So if I wanted to pick a particular valve to keep, we could do that as well. Let's move to the next step. And you can see SOLIDWORKS has removed most of these parts from the assembly. We might go ahead and select the piston, the connecting rods that we really don't need, that seem to have been left for some reason. And we could also remove the camshaft that we certainly don't need. Let's go back, add selected components. We'll get this. In order to select through transparent parts, you need to have that setting set. And that setting can be found under Tools, Options, Display/Selection. Down towards the bottom, you'll find Enable Selection Through Transparency. In the final assembly that I want to send out, I don't want to have any assembly motion. But I've just seen a couple of parts that I do want to include. So let's go back one more time and click in the exceptions. What I really want to do here is I want to include these two pulleys, then hide the rest. The pulleys were all imported from 3D Content Central, an online library. One of the options of saving out the product of a defeature function is to save it into the 3D Content Central online library. So you can produce your proprietary components, defeature them, and then send them up to the library for other people to use. We've already established that we don't want to have any moving parts. That's going to be further enforced because I'd like to save this to a multi-body part. And you cannot have relative motion within the multi-body part. In step 3, we get the warning that SOLIDWORKS fills parts with material to remove internal details. That might include parts like the engine block or the valve cover. I can see already that SOLIDWORKS has made a mistake by extending this face longer than it needs to be. SOLIDWORKS is going to go ahead and remove some internal details and simplify the geometry so that we aren't sharing more information than we need to. In the final step, SOLIDWORKS asks us again how we want to save out the results. We can save them as a separate file and link to the original if we want to, publish to Content Central if we want to, or store the settings for future use. Let's just save as a separate file, give it a name, and let SOLIDWORKS do its thing. Now SOLIDWORKS has left us in the assembly. We can go ahead and open up the file that SOLIDWORKS created, and you'll find that listed in your recent files list. And here you can see you have a series of defeatured features in the feature manager. In previous versions of SOLIDWORKS, these were all just body features, so they look like imported features. But in 2013, this has been changed to defeatured features using the defeature symbol. So this is what your customer would get. You might want to cut off the section of this motor that SOLIDWORKS added erroneously. And if we look inside, we can see that all the moving parts inside are missing. And if we hide the solid body on top for the valve cover, the valve train is missing except for the camshaft that I didn't select. Now let's take a look at just the engine block, and I can do that by right-clicking on the body and using the isolate command. Isolate in assemblies works just like it does in multi-body parts. And let's get a better look at this body by turning off the transparency. We can see that the holes or the bores for the cylinders are missing, as well as some of the smaller holes. We could have elected to go through and remove some of this type of detail. To exit the isolate mode, just find the isolate toolbar, which tends to float around, and click on exit isolate.